All right, well, it's 12 o'clock sharp here, so I think as people are filtering in, I'm going to go ahead and get this started. Welcome everyone to this month's University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, or MCAP webinar. My name is Greg Klinger. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota and a member of MCAP, and I'll be facilitating this webinar on reducing carbon emissions from buildings, a systems approach, with our two guests today. And I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, but I think first to our attendees who are muted for this webinar, I'd invite you just to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, kind of what your interest is in this particular webinar. And with that, I think I'll introduce our speakers. Imani Mosher is a recent graduate of St. Olaf College with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. Excuse me, I'm going to share this too, and a concentration in environmental studies. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just sharing the screen in the background. She's passionate about the intersections of political science and environmental studies as they relate to climate justice. At Precipitate, she works on planning projects, sustainable design consulting, and climate justice advocacy and research. At St. Olaf, she was a co-founder of the Climate Justice Collective, CJC, an organization that drove the successful divestment campaign at the college and uplifted the movement to stop Line 3 among students. Our other guest today, Elizabeth Turner, is an architect with a passion for finding synergies to create thriving, equitable communities that depend less on the purchase of energy, saving both operational costs and carbon emissions. She founded Precipitate in 2017 to explore emerging methods of holistically integrated design at the intersection of architecture, research, and education. She's a certified Passive House consultant through the Passive House Institute US, also known by the acronym of PHIUS, P-H-I-U-S, and a 2020 recipient of the Energy News Network's 40 Under 40, recognizing her leadership in the transition to a clean energy economy. Elizabeth volunteers extensively with the American Institute of Architects, AIA, Minnesota, advocating for public policy with a focus on equity and inclusion towards truly sustainable communities for all. Just a couple friendly reminders before we go ahead and get started. The webinar is an hour-long webinar and will end at 1 p.m. All participants are muted during the presentations, and so we will communicate through Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, put it in the Q&A and the panelists will be able to address them at the end. And then lastly, this webinar will be recorded and posted on MCAP's YouTube channel at a later date. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Imani and Elizabeth. I'll stop sharing my screen, and if you want to start sharing your slides, we'll go ahead and get started.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having us here today. We're excited to talk about our approach to reducing carbon emissions in buildings. And I think answering this question, like why is an architecture firm doing so much with public policy and planning work? And we founded Precipitate to respond nimbly to the pressing social, economic, and ecological justice issues of today, through deep listening and engagement, leading to thoughtful design at the intersection of architectural research and education. So we've been around for 5 years, and there are 5 of us now working on this common mission and goal. And we do a mix of architecture, planning, and sustainable design consulting projects, primarily in the state of Minnesota, all working on these bigger issues. And the reason why we're really passionate about this is the role of architecture in reducing carbon emissions. So if we look at this graphic from Architecture 2030, annual global carbon emissions, 27% of those are from building operations. So heating and cooling, lighting, plug loads, anything you plug into the wall. But there's also 10% of carbon emissions that are from building materials and construction, and then other construction industry roles as well. So a large piece of the global carbon emissions pie can be adapted and mitigated through architectural strategies. So the 2030 commitment decided to take this on in 2010 by saying that they would reduce from a baseline of 2003 emissions 60% by 2010, 70%, 80% today, moving to 90% in 2025 and carbon neutrality in 2030. So this seems really simple, right? Like, this is a great plan. We're going to reduce every 5 years a little bit more, and we'll have solved the built environment's role in climate change. In reality, there's about 400 architecture firms that have signed on to this commitment. Last year, I think it was 17 that actually met that 80% reduction goal. A lot of people who are signing on and tracking their projects, but not achieving that goal. And that kind of is the bare minimum that we need to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change from the built environment. So we figured we need to do something differently. And for us, systems thinking is a really big part of this. So the traditional approach says, well, the role of architects is just to design building. That's all we're going to do. The systems approach sees buildings as one part of a larger system. So we were finding that it was really hard to design buildings that reduce their carbon emissions in those traditional systems. And so we needed to create a new system and take a systems approach to addressing the reasons why we couldn't build systems and couldn't build buildings that were meeting the carbon emissions goals. So one approach that we've taken is advocacy and building science. So you can see we've I joined the Government Affairs Committee with the American Institute of Architects, Minnesota. They have a great lobbyist that's helped us meet with representatives and senators in the state, meeting with folks nationally as well, and going to building science training and having our staff become certified passive house consultants. And we'll talk more about what that means later. And then planning has been a really important part of this too. So we worked with Bemidji State University on their climate action and resilience plan to look at a community, a system as a whole, and figure out how to reduce carbon emissions and be resilient in that community and campus. So their president, Hensrud, signed the climate commitment in April of 2019. And this is through Second Nature, their climate commitment for carbon and resilience. It combines both of those into one climate commitment. The focus of our work really became quite quickly that we needed to build relationships through appreciative inquiry and focus on building relationships as a way to make the community more resilient in our path to make the community more resilient. So in nature, we know that systems that have more interconnections are more resilient to future disruptions. And we found that to be true in the human relationships as well. So we started mapping all the people working on resilience in Bemidji. And you can see there's quite an extensive group from nonprofits, business, utilities, local government, Bemidji State University itself, and other education groups. And we had roundtables and world cafes with these organizations, as well as specific directed conversations with these organizations and ones that were open to the community at large. We found a really powerful ally in a group called 100 Cups of Coffee, which was working to sit down with residents of Bemidji and talk to them about the issues in their community, and also in an effort to build resilience on the more personal scale. So this is one of the questions that they asked: do you feel you have a voice when decisions are made in the community? And you can see that it varied by race of people in the community. But overall, more people felt like they didn't have a voice than did. And in our planning process, we found this to be true too, that one of the first things we needed to work on in order to create a resilient community was actually making people feel like they had a voice in decision making. We also started with strengths, and this is a strategy called Appreciative Inquiry, where we start with what is working well in a community. And there was a really, really strong consensus in Bemidji that the connection to place and nature was across the board something that people were really proud of and drew them to their community. Also a really strong connection to community with strong relationships, but with that, a desire to expand what community meant to include everyone who was a resident of Bemidji. And also this idea of hardiness, so self-sufficiency and reliance on personal and family resilience. And folks really wanted to be able to strengthen relationships as a key opportunity, which is what we focused on in this plan. So connecting residents to one another, connecting residents to resources, and connecting organizations within the community. We also looked at carbon emissions data for the campus itself and did some data visualization of where emissions were coming from. So electricity and heating being the primary emissions from this community. We compared facilities conditions to how much energy they were using. So you can see at the left, that is the current facilities condition. Green is the newest buildings with the least need for repair. And orange is the most need for repair. And there were quite a few of the residence halls that were identified as needing repair and also high energy users. One of the things that really we kept coming back to in this plan was what was our framework that we're using. So on the left was our initial framework, where we talked about the kind of core pieces of that we're going to explore and what it meant to build a resilience plan. So we started with lifelong learning, safety and security, infrastructure and services, wellness, inclusion and equity, and economic opportunity, that really leading to community resilience. And what we found was that people really wanted to talk about the physical things. So more like the stocks in a system, the things that you can measure and discuss. And that's where we ended up in our final report doing the grouping. So things like economic opportunity, water, energy, housing, transportation, materials and waste, and health and wellness. And this is a big transition to get to. And we got to this point after we had a significant number of community listening sessions. The idea that all of these pieces, the core of them is to have equity and inclusion, leading to the outer circle, which is community resilience. We also found it really important to visualize both the issues and aspirations in a way that was beautiful and engaging to people. So this is our cover for the housing portion of the report, where we thought about what does housing mean for not only people, but the plants and animals and insects that are in the surrounding area as well. And energy burden was a really important part that we discovered. So connecting carbon emissions in the form of energy use to people's lives. And as you can see here, there's a really high energy burden in this part of the state. Part of the reason for this is that instead of natural gas, a lot of homes use electricity, and it's also colder. So there's quite a few places that the energy burden is 6 to 10% or more of people's annual income. We did find that a strength is that there's a lot of the affordable housing and housing in the city is really close to parks. So this was a strength that we were able to visually show. And that led us to our next project, which is the City of Minneapolis Climate Equity Plan. And I'm going to let Imani speak about our work with the city to talk about climate and equity in this planning process, which we kicked off in February and is currently underway.
Sweet. Yeah, so a lot of our work on the climate equity plan was informed by our experience with the Bemidji State University climate action plan as it relates to engagement efforts, accessible and meaningful data visualization, and appreciative inquiry. Going into this plan, we recognize how important it is to get people on the same page and familiar with the context that we're working within. So we start off here with a timeline. As you can see, sustainability efforts started in 1990 with the stakeholder group called SEAC, Community Environmental Advisory Commission, being established. Later in 2013, we see the first climate action plan adopted by the city, followed by the commercial benchmarking policy. Later in 2013, the Environmental Vision Advisory Committee in 2014, who does a lot of recommendations from the community to the Climate Energy Partnership Board. And then in 2017, our green zones were designated, and later on, the utility franchise fee was increased. All really important milestones in our work to inform our most recent work on the climate equity plan. Here we can see a graph of our carbon budget in that light blue in the very back, highlighting how much we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to mitigate the most serious consequences of climate change. Those dotted lines highlight what it would look like if we had continued emitting at 2019 levels in the very dark blue, and then in that green is if we continued emitting at current trend levels. So you can see we still have quite a bit of work to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to remain within our fair share of the carbon budget. So definitely keeping in those very tangible and technical greenhouse gas emission goals within our plan. So here's a little bit what our process looked like. It's broken down into 4 major categories: listening, testing, deciding, and reporting. Like Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we have been listening since February. So far, that has looked like engagement sessions, listening sessions, tabling at community festivals. We had a table at Juneteenth and Somali Independence Day. We have a survey out for people to access at any time to give us comments and feedback, and really just trying to connect with as many people as possible. We are getting ready to move into our testing phase, where we're going to kind of take everything we've heard to establish some working groups and a steering committee, which will comprise of folks who were part of our previous engagement in the listening sessions. They're welcome to join, and we will do all that and make sure that it sounds good with everybody we've connected with so far. And then we'll go into our deciding phase, where we'll start drafting with the goal of having a climate equity plan to present to council in January of next year and hopefully be adopted. So here's a little bit more about our planning and organizational structure. So this large bubble is highlighting our stakeholders, who we've been really intentional about connecting with. So we've been speaking with some departments from the city of Minneapolis, neighborhood organizations. We have listening sessions coming up with the Lao community and the Somali community. We're connecting with younger folks from Climate Generation, hosting community forums, the survey that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Also connecting with committees like the Public Health Advisory Committee and EVAC and SEAC that were on the timeline. And looking forward to establishing those working groups following all of our listening and connecting with utilities and city climate programs for the more technical advice on the plan. So alongside a lot of listening and discussing, we've been doing a lot of reading. So here we're looking at some of the previous studies and the themes that we found were highlighted among those. You can see all the way on the far left is the Climate Action Plan, bringing us all the way to the other side, the People's Climate and Equity Plan that's being championed by MN 350. And the themes are roughly color-coded. So you can see things related to building and electrification in orange. We have transportation in green. The dark blue is opportunity, green economy, funding. The lighter blue, land use. That like medium blue, I suppose, is self-determination, healthy communities, education. And it's really interesting to see first what these previous studies are pulling out as important themes, but to also see how those themes change as time progresses. So the Climate Action Plan is highlighting buildings and energy, waste and recycling, transportation and land use. And then if we look at all the other additional items that the People's Climate and Equity Plan, whom we are connecting with regularly and in conversation with, all those great things they are highlighting. So keeping in mind what's been done before and leaning into that expertise. We saw this one on that previous slide, the 100% renewable electricity blueprint. Tells us all the great things about electrification, but it also highlights the additional benefits to the community that come alongside electrifying. So green jobs, more healthy communities and environments, equity, resilience, and all those other things highlighted in those blue bubbles. And another great reminder that we can't sacrifice equity for expediency, something that we're really centering in our timeline through listening and intentional outreach. All right, back to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Imani. So I think it's both of these planning processes have really highlighted us for us that tie between architecture that reduces energy use and the benefits to community. And I think it is more expensive. It can be more expensive to build architecture that uses less energy upfront. But when you think about at the scale of entire communities and how you're resilient to a lot of things, increasing energy costs and more extreme weather events, being able to stay in your home, all of these things, that brings us back to then our role as architects and how we can reduce both operational energy, operational carbon, which is energy used to heat and cool and operate the building, as well as embodied carbon, which we'll talk about at the end of this section as well. So we've done a lot of work with sustainable rating systems, so LEED and B3, Green Globes, Enterprise Green Communities. And what we keep coming back to, and we still do, we think there's value in those systems, but the one that we've seen really most drastically reduce the carbon emissions from buildings is the Passive House or FIA standard. So passive building is, the goal is to reduce energy consumption from space conditioning through an efficient envelope. And a lot of people think that means like living in a little thermos with no windows and no daylight and fresh air. And it's actually kind of the opposite. So think of it more as a really fluffy winter coat that allows you to go out and experience the world and be connected in the ways that you want to be, but also be comfortable. Also, like a winter coat, it works really well if you have a winter coat and a hat and gloves and snow pants. But if you're going to go out with a really nice winter coat and shorts and flip-flops, you're going to still be cold. And I think when we think about buildings and making sure that they're using the least amount of energy possible in the most efficient way, that's something really important to keep in mind. You might hear people say, like, it doesn't make sense to have triple pane windows. Well, it doesn't if your walls are not also well insulated and you have an air sealing as well. So thinking about the whole building as a system within this larger societal system is where we focus our energy. So the passive house principles themselves, there's 5 of them. 3 of them are passive strategies meant to reduce energy and just shrink the amount of energy demand that the building has. So we have a really airtight building envelope. This looks like air sealing, making sure that it's continuous around the whole entire building, and then super insulated and thermal bridge free. So you'll see walls that are a little bit thicker that have more insulation, and also continuous insulation. So it goes, it wraps the entire building, and you don't have breaks for like a stud wall and wood that's kind of sticking through that insulation, which is just a highway to let cold air at cold temperatures into your home, and also creates some moisture and mold issues. Supporting that then, that reduced need for energy is energy recovery systems. So fresh air where energy is recovered when it's leaving the building to preheat the air that's coming into the building, and then really efficient mechanical systems to meet that smaller energy demand.
So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the additional benefits to Passive House that go beyond energy, or kind of are like a bonus from the decreased energy demand. So the decreased energy demand can lower utility costs, which is really important and great for affordable housing, allows the building owners to decrease utility costs for the tenants. This also opens doors for other homeowners to really explore and invest in renewables and become more independent with their energy. All of these things supporting equity and environmental justice. More technically, Passive House does really amazing things for indoor air quality through increased ventilation. It has increased thermal comfort and noise control. as well as really streamlining the layout of water to reduce the distance it needs to travel and have really efficient water heaters so that we're not using any extra energy to get hot water and only heating it up when we really need it. All of these things really important and meaningful benefits to Passive House as a result of the decreased energy. So yeah. So this slide's just kind of highlighting some of the benefits I touched on earlier. So the high performance building envelope leads to more thermal comfort and moisture control, which is really important for mold and dust, and gives us more fresh air in our homes. That is one of the occupant benefits. It's quieter, it's more resilient to extreme weather and power outages. And this expands to community benefits where people can become more invested in their spaces and more connected to their communities, leading to lower turnover and more resilient, strong communities. And the owner benefits as well. Using Passive House, there's lots of funding opportunities, and the reduced maintenance and operation costs that I mentioned earlier can really lower costs for tenants and lower turnover in that same way.
Thanks, Imani. And one note here is sometimes it's really hard to see these benefits because of what's called a split incentive. So making sure that we're supporting, so that's when people who own the building are different than the people who are you paying utility bills. So there's no incentive for people who own the building to spend money on energy efficiency upgrades. So that's one of the reasons that public policy and supportive programs are really helpful to getting these projects built, to kind of mitigate the impact of that split incentive. So here's an example of some of the buildings that we've helped get Passive House certified or Passive House pre-certified in the past few years here. Hook and Ladder was in Minneapolis, and that's 56 units of affordable housing. Verdon is in St. Paul, and it is currently open and operating, and that's 82 units of affordable housing. In Madison, there is a townhome that will be Passive House certified, as well as their community center for the entire townhome development. And in Northfield, we worked with the Hillcrest Village team to model their duplex to see the most cost-effective path to get to net zero. They ended up not getting certified in Passive House, but they got really close. They figured out a cost-effective path to net zero, which instead of just having more solar panels, they upgraded the windows and building systems and added increased insulation and made a really comfortable building for the people who live there, and actually found that that was a more cost-effective way to get to net zero than just adding more solar panels alone. And then we are working as architects for Minneapolis Homes in Minneapolis, doing 5 Passive House certified projects that will be for sale for owners that will be Passive House certified. So this is kind of applicable from the single family up to the 82 unit, and there's even some skyscrapers in New York that follow this method as well, and starting to get to be more public and commercial buildings as well. I think this graph really shows why we care about it. So the CSBR did a study on kind of the average amount of utility use and energy use in affordable housing. So in 2015, this is 51 properties. The average use was 76.2 kBTUs per square foot per year. You can see the majority of the use is for space heating in red, and some in domestic hot water and electricity as well. With the FIAS Plus certified building and modeled in WUFI Passive, that space heating use is really drastically reduced. We have more space cooling because these buildings are air conditioned, where a lot of the other the currently existing affordable housing is not air conditioned. So that's increasing slightly. And then our domestic hot water use is reduced as well. But it's really interesting to see that we're using about as much energy to heat domestic hot water as we are to heat the air in the building. Similarly, for the Verdant project, we're getting that SB 2030 goal, the 2030 goal coming back in. So the goal is a 80% reduction, and our target was 21 kBTUs per square foot per year. Without solar, we're coming in at 27, so it's 74% reduction. You can see again a really small use for space heating and cooling, which is what we're focusing on with Passive House. And then with the solar needed to meet Passive House standards, we got that down to 15, so for a total of an 85% reduction from that baseline energy use. One of the things we focus on a lot that I think is really fun is just the details. So you can see on the left, these are kind of the standard wall details that were planned for the townhome in Northfield. And then we worked with the contractor and architect and design team and consultants to think about how we could reduce the thermal bridging in those details. And you see those at the right. This is something that's a pretty low cost, but has a pretty big impact. So the heat loss from those thermal bridges was about 6,000 kBTUs per year. And we got that down to about just under 468 kBTUs per year, just by changing the design. But we've talked a lot about reducing carbon emissions from operation costs, so energy use in the buildings. But when we think about how much we need to reduce carbon emissions in the next 5, 10, 20 years, the operational carbon is only about half of that picture. So the other kind of based on business as usual projections, half of that would be embodied carbon. So all of the carbon emissions that go into building the buildings that we're constructing now. So that's a part that we're wanting to think about as well.
All right. So I've been really lucky to work alongside Precipitate and all my wonderful colleagues there. I don't come from a background in architecture, but I certainly recognize the really powerful levers that exist in the built environment to address climate change. So this slide is kind of exploring the materials and the carbon impacts that they have. And materials wasn't something I thought I would get super excited about in the built environment, but as you can see at the very top, looking at extruded polystyrene, which I believe is a spray foam, that has a really high carbon impact. And even among the materials that have a carbon impact, you can see how it gets a little bit better. Even with the expanded polystyrene, there's a really serious reduction in the carbon impacts. But it can go even further, looking at things like wool, dense packed cellulose cork, hempcrete, and even straw bales with the ability to actually sequester carbon. And that was just a really exciting thing for me to discover and continue to explore with Precipitate to address carbon in the embodied aspects of the built environment. So the next slide is a really cool picture of a project that we have been a part of that is a straw bale home in Uptown Minneapolis. It's been really cool to see this process go on, especially in our climate zone. And I think, Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it off to you to talk more about the technical stuff.
Yeah, so when our client first came to us, they wanted to build a passive house. And then as we started talking about what the insulation would be in the walls, they're like, I don't really want all that foam and that embodied carbon to be in my house. So they came to us with the idea of straw bale, and we figured out how to make it work. One of the additional things that they really liked is that people can build it together. So they hosted last fall a lot of community build events where people got to have hands-on training in how to build straw bale and work together. So we were not sure, if being straw bale, the building would struggle to get Passive House certified. But there's still a 70% energy reduction based on compared to a code baseline building, even with being straw bale. And because they have solar panels on both their existing triplex on the property and this building as well, the building will be net positive. And so it'll produce more energy than it will consume and have walls that sequester more carbon than they use. So you can see this is the wall. Above the zero line is all of the things that have embodied carbon that are contributing to global warming. So wallboard, lime plaster, metal bath. But below the line is the insulation itself. And so we think, based on these calculations, that this building will actually sequester more carbon than it emits during construction, and be a really low energy user as well. So that brings us to our final slide. We talk about this a lot in architecture, how the integrative process, shifting effort earlier into pre-design schematic design before a lot of the design decisions are made, can really help create more resilient, adapted, and lower energy using buildings than waiting to the end. And I think this is true in terms of the impact of change really decreases the further along in the process you get, and the cost of that change increases as well. So a lot of public policy sometimes focuses on just moving to renewable energy, which is really important. But sometimes that focus means that we don't think about renewable energy until the very end, bidding in construction or occupancy, sometimes in some cases, where you have then lost the ability to reduce the energy consumption of your buildings. So we like to think about the operational energy that the buildings are going to use way at the beginning in pre-design, and have those discussions, talking about the embodied carbon that's going to be in those buildings in pre-design as well, and really think about how we can reduce the cost and increase the impact of the carbon strategies that we're making. And we think about this too in the larger planning projects and advocacy work that we're doing. We need to be having discussions about building energy use before the pre-design. So far to the left of this, because we have systems that make it really, really hard and difficult to build really cost-effective, low carbon buildings in terms of operational and embodied carbon use. And we need to work to change those systems and have public policies and support systems in place so that people can build the low carbon buildings that they want to live in, that are healthy and safe for them, and that will be resilient in upcoming climate change, as well as help to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. So we'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Elizabeth and Imani. So yeah, we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A session of this webinar. And just a reminder, you can go ahead and ask questions in the Q&A. I think I'll go ahead and get it started with Elizabeth. You mentioned a term called thermal bridging, and I was wondering if I may have missed it, if you could kind of define that or give an example of what that is.
Yeah, so I think if you're familiar, you might not be familiar with how walls are constructed typically, and we have a 2x4 inch called a 2x4 piece of wood that is placed every 16 to 24 inches within a wall, and then we fill in usually fiberglass batt insulation between that. Well, and then we put siding on the outside and drywall on the inside. Well, that 2x4 is directly touching the outside. And so in the wintertime, it gets really cold because there's nothing protecting it from the outside environment. So when it is touching the inside then of your home, it's a cold spot in the wall. And basically, like a radiator kind of is a fin that lets a lot of heat leave your building. It's also cold, so you will get the warm air from inside. If you have any punctures in your air barrier, will condense on that cold 2x4 and lead you to have moisture in your wall. So it's an issue from both energy use and then just durability and resilience of your wall as well. And And the really simple thing, the way to think about reducing thermal bridging in the most straightforward way is we just put insulation in the exterior of that 2x4, so that it has what's called a thermal break and doesn't get as cold as the rest of the wall.
Great, thanks for answering that. Got a few questions in the Q&A, and I think I'll start with some of the ones that focus more on the last part of the presentation, and then kind of go backwards. So I have a question here. What were the motivators for the Hook and Ladder and Northfield projects? Were they policy-driven, grant-funded, owner-driven, community-driven?
Yeah, so both were separate. For Hook and Ladder, it was really owner-driven. They wanted to be the first passive house apartment building in the state, and they were actually the first passive house building in our whole climate zone, which is pretty exciting. For Northfield, the motivation was really to be net zero. Northfield has a really excellent, so this is why climate action planning and architecture are really connected, right? So they have a really strong climate action plan as a community. And part of that plan was to develop a demonstration project of how you could get to net zero cost effectively. And so when they were developing some townhomes that are highly affordable and run by a local nonprofit, people who are on the community organization volunteering for the climate action plan also were on the group of folks supporting the development of these townhomes and wanted to use it as a demonstration project for how you could develop cost-effective, resilient homes as affordably as possible.
Okay, great. Let's see. So kind of jumping back to the listening sessions. There's a question here, but I'm going to kind of ask a similar one. Maybe you can address both, or either of you can. So I was curious about how you decided on what stakeholders to do outreach with. And then there was another question about how did you encourage participation with those stakeholder listening sessions?
Yeah, Imani, do you want to take this one? I can say that one of the most important things we started with was we partnered with Urban Design Perspectives as our partner for this, who has a lot of experience doing community engagement work in Minneapolis. So choosing the right team is kind of the first step.
Yeah, absolutely. Urban Design Perspectives did a really great job connecting with leadership at the city, with the neighborhood relations department to get us connected with some representatives from the communities that we knew we wanted to be connected with. And we casted a wide net. We have been working with 8 representatives who have been compensated to kind of usher us in and help us communicate in a way that makes the most sense with the communities that we are hoping to be in discussion with. So yes, they were compensated.
The rookie mistake of not unmuting. Thanks for answering that. A question here from Doug. What do you think the most important factors will be in the success of this climate plan that make it equitable? And equitable, I think he said, to clarify, equitable in terms of the future outcomes, say 15 years from now as a result of the plan.
Yeah, maybe we can both answer this one. I'm excited to hear what you have to say, Imani, too. I think for us, it's really important that, well, we know there's a truth that we can't solve the climate crisis with the same tools and methods and systems that created the climate crisis. And the people who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution of for the problem. So there's a lot of environmental justice leadership in Minneapolis that we just need to listen to. And they have created plans with the North and South Side green zones. And beyond that as well, of what they would like their communities to look like. And our job is to get them funding and support and policies that support what they already want to do. And I think the planning process is an important way to do that. I think so that will make it equitable if we listen to people who have the solutions. number one. And I think the other piece is not just looking at kind of the outcomes, but thinking about how we can make everybody's daily life better in our work on climate action. And I think the buildings, building better buildings instead of just only focusing on renewable energy, I think is one way you can see that demonstrated. And there's others in transportation and waste, focusing not on just kind of the bottom line, but how you improve people's lives along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm thinking on very similar lines, both different words. What's been really challenging about the process in the best way is that we've been waiting to assign our working groups until we've heard from everybody in the community to really identify what we want to focus on. And so for me, a successful climate equity plan will embody the community. You know, it won't have to really say, this section is about equity. It will just reflect the hopes and the visions and the needs of the people that we're talking to. And the other thing is, I think that the plan needs to do a really effective job of addressing the issues that we need to today, while also thinking big picture. So finding the balance between we need to make people's lives better right now, but we also need to ensure the future of the people who are here today and future generations. So finding that balance and staying connected to the community.
Great, thank you both. So one question going back to the Bemidji State work you did. So someone says, I'm intrigued by showing both the facilities condition and energy use, those two different maps, to show buildings needing repair along with energy use. Is energy not traditionally included in facilities assessments, is the question?
So this has been like my number one, for the past decade, I'd say it was the thing that I was really, really passionate about, is when we're talking about buildings needing repair, that we're also talking about how much energy they use. I'd say that those have been totally separate conversations for a really long time. I'd say in the past few years here, people are starting to talk more about it. But I'd really love that to come to the forefront as well. I think when a building is in need of repair, that's like when you're replacing the windows and redoing the siding, like those are the cost-effective times to improve the energy performance of the building too. I know that the city of Minneapolis has done some studies of this too. Like those are also times that people are in an emergency situation. It's not often like, oh, I want to replace my roof because I just feel like it. Now's a good time. It's like there's a crisis and I need to do it as quickly as possible. So helping people put plans in place so that when they have emergencies coming up and it is a time to replace their water heater or furnace or roof or windows, they can do that in a way that thinks about energy efficiency. I think there's a difference between like college campuses and then the individual homeowner about when it's that about too.
Thanks. A couple more questions. I actually had one, Imani, for you had a slide about different types of insulation materials and their essentially carbon consumption or the associated carbon footprint. What is EPS? I think it was extruded polystyrene. Is that like the pink foam, the solid foam? I'm trying to put together what it looks like with what the name is here.
Yeah, that's great. And I will immediately hand that off to Elizabeth.
Okay.
Yeah, so XPS is the pink foam. It's extruded. And it's hard because they both start with EX. But that's the one that is the worst. They're working, that slide is a few years old, and they are working on what's called blowing agents to reduce the carbon emissions from those. So we hope too that will be a lower carbon option in the future, just because they're working on less carbon intensive ways of making that. But EPS is expanded polystyrene, and you can think of that as like your typical styrofoam cup. That's the white fluffy balls, and that comes in sheets as well. But the problem is that per inch, the expanded is kind of less of a R value per inch than the extruded. So if you don't have a lot of space, it's really easy to go to the one that is kind of a better bang for your buck in terms of space.
Okay, great. Last question here from Doug, different Doug this time. Given the financial power of the fossil fuel industry, do you have any suggestions for them in time, which is getting very short?
Yes. Do you want to go first, Imani, this time? I think that it's tricky because a lot of the times the people, the entities and organizations that can make the most impact often benefit from the current structure. So like the people in power are propped up by the systems that we have, right? So I think natural gas companies are a good example of this. There's some incentive to where is the incentive to reduce consumption? There's some incentive to reduce consumption because they make money from each connection and their connection fees versus the supply. But there's less of an incentive to actually disconnect people from natural gas completely because they would not exist. So I think that like doing some power mapping and figuring out where power is held and where organizations are in structures of power are really important in figuring out those relationships. And it's different in every city, it's different for every building, it's different in every state. So there's no one size fits all solution for this, right? It's like really figuring out who holds power and how you can shift things so that you change incentives and change the goals. Because we can focus on like a 10% reduction, and a 10% reduction is not going to get us to a livable planet in 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the one size doesn't fit all idea. I think I don't have an answer, but I think what gives me hope is conversations like this and continuing to discuss with our friends and family about climate change and the impact of fossil fuels on our world, and identifying those levers that have the most meaningful power in our own lives and taking advantage of those. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, for the presentation today. Just as a reminder to everyone, we do have a short evaluation. You can find it this link here at the end of the webinar. We always appreciate the feedback. And with that, there appear to be no other questions. So again, thank you very much, Elizabeth and Imani, for your time. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the webinar, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.